Before we start with the talk of Lucia would be to start the recording, and I've just learned that this is already going on. So Lucia, I think this was our part. Now the stage is yours, and we are looking very much forward to your talk. And again, it's great that you're here today and that you have volunteered to give this talk here on mental health, which I think is a very important topic, and I think we're all looking very much forward.
Thank you. So I'm going to start sharing my screen, and if somebody could confirm when it's looking correct, that would be great.
Perfect.
Okay. So yeah, welcome to our talk on mental health literacy. It's brought to you by me, Lucia Rotheray, but on behalf of Dragonfly Mental Health, which is a sort of wider organization for mental health in academia. Before I start our talk, I have to give you a content warning because most of this talk is about mental illness, and that will touch on quite a few difficult topics, including suicide and trauma. If any of the stuff we talk about either in the talk or in the question session afterwards is upsetting or distressing to you, we totally encourage you to walk away if you need to, and you'll always be welcome to come back into the conversation. We do, of course, want to have a supportive environment for this talk. If anyone in the audience is experiencing a crisis at the moment and needs some help, there's a very good website you can look at. This iasp.info/resources/crisis centers. And this is somewhere that you can find resources anywhere in the world in your own region. And of course, I have to tell you that I am not a medical professional. I can't give you any medical or diagnostic advice, and Dragonfly Mental Health is not a healthcare provider organization. Nothing I tell you today is medical advice, and nothing I'll say in the talk or in the discussion afterwards is any kind of substitute for speaking to a medical professional. So what are we going to talk about exactly? I'm going to start by introducing briefly myself and then the organization Dragonfly. And then I'll give you a quick idea of what the talk is and isn't sort of supposed to do, how it functions. And then we'll get into the main topic. We'll start by talking about the idea of a spectrum of mental health. And then we'll focus in on one part of that spectrum, which is mental illnesses or mental disease. And we'll look at several either commonly experienced or commonly discussed mental illnesses, their symptoms, their causes, their treatments. After that, we'll have a little discussion about the borderlands or intersectionality and mental health and some things we might need to think about in our academic community. And then I'll open up to you for comments, questions, discussion. So starting with me, who am I? I am not currently a physicist, although I do have a history with your subject, but I quite quickly became a mathematician in my career. I've also spent a lot of time teaching both maths and physics in universities and teaching outside of universities, which is very interesting because it's given me a bit of a deeper insight into how weird universities can be. And as well as teaching, I've spent quite a lot of time working in advocacy within academia. Specifically, I'm interested in helping people kind of identify their own needs and stand up for them. So advocate for their rights and well-being within an academic setting, because I don't think that students are taught how to do this or encouraged to do it enough. As for Dragonfly Mental Health, we're an organization that works to improve knowledge about mental health in academia, address culture directly and build community, all with the goal of preventing mental health problems and improving the well-being of academics. We have three main arms. There's the Global Consortium for Academic Mental Health, which conducts research into academic mental health and devises plans for how to address systemic issues in academia. And much like academia as a system, we are very international, and the consortium is made of researchers from all over the world. And these researchers are academic researchers who provide evidence-based solutions to the problems that they identify. We also run the Dragonfly Cafe, and this is more of a networking and socializing event. It takes place on Zoom on Friday nights. I think it's 7 p.m. Central European time. It's somewhere that you can go to talk about mental health, academia, studies, and basically anything that you want to talk about within your community of academics. It's a really good entry point for getting to know Dragonfly as a whole as well. So if you're curious about us, we could encourage you to come to our cafes and ask us all of your questions. And the last thing we do is on-campus programs. So these are events where we talk to academic communities directly to discuss how we can create changes to improve their mental health. That includes things like today, one-off programs, and also more like long-term consulting. The best place to find out about all of this is on our website, so I'll just reiterate it here. It's dragonflymentalhealth.org. Now, all of this change in culture and building community has to be very customized because every culture and community is, of course, a little bit different. But everything we do is based on these so-called 5 domains of excellence that our founders have identified. And again, we can read about details of all of these ideas on the website. The basic premise for all of them is to build knowledge, build skills, practical skills for culture change and mental well-being, and to address structures and improve them where necessary. And we'll end our introduction with a little shout out because Dragonfly is a very quickly growing organization. We have over 250 volunteers at this point in over 30 countries from all sorts of academic backgrounds. And if you're interested by what you see today and you would like to become one of them, that is very much an option. As I mentioned, you can come to the cafe or email us or contact us on social media. So that's our introduction. Now into the talk. This talk is a very brief mental health introduction, and we talk about a few mental health conditions. It's really the beginning of an ongoing conversation, and not just the conversation that we'll have this afternoon or whatever time it is for you, but ongoing conversations that we'd like you all to be able to have with your friends and colleagues and hopefully supervisors, lecturers, everybody in your academic environment. It's not a comprehensive knowledge and response training, and it's not even everything you need to know in a nutshell. Because even the nutshell version of the introduction to mental health is much longer than 45 minutes. So I mentioned that we think of mental health on a spectrum. This is very important. There aren't just 2 states of mentally healthy and mentally ill. There are many more. The first one, and kind of the ideal one that we'd like to be in as often as possible, is health. And this is when we're doing well. We're feeling good, or at least reasonable for our situation, and our moods are generally positive. The next step kind of down from that is something that's inherent to life and that we all experience, and that's stress. And it's usually caused by external things, deadlines, moving house, having a flu. And there are lots of things in life that will bring our mental state down a little bit. But hopefully, when whatever external source of stress passes, we can bounce back into that mentally healthy state. Sometimes we don't, however. Sometimes we sort of stay low for longer periods, or we struggle to recover in the absence of stress factors. And we call this kind of state distress. And this is when we're not necessarily responding to things in such an obvious or measured way. And it's starting to impact our life, impact our ability to work or our relationships, for example. But this is still quite different to disease. Disease means that we have diagnosable levels of particular kinds of distress, particular symptoms, which vary with every disease, and medical intervention is recommended, if not necessary. Again, diseases have to meet specific criteria. And at the very far end of our spectrum, we have crisis. And this is It's what it sounds like. It's when immediate help is needed. Unfortunately, a lot of people will wait until they find themselves in crisis and unable to function before they seek help, but would really encourage you to seek help in the disease or even the distress, ideally, phase of the spectrum. So I already mentioned that most of our talk is going to focus here on disease. So first of all, what makes something a disease? This is a basic question, but it's necessary before we can talk about diseases. So the symptoms, whatever they may be for a particular condition, must be consistent and last for more than a reasonable time. And to be clear, consistent does not mean constant. It might mean more days than not. It might mean fairly frequently. It might mean regularly. For example, no one's likely to be having a panic attack for 2 weeks solid, but if you have 2 or 3 panic attacks in 2 weeks, that's pretty consistent. And this reasonable time varies a lot with different conditions, but it's surprisingly short. So for anxiety and depression, the reasonable time after which one can seek treatment is 2 weeks. Please bear that in mind because most people will wait much longer. After 2 weeks of depression symptoms, it's recommended that somebody seek medical help. Whatever symptoms we experience should also represent a change in our normal experiences and behaviors. So for example, for some people with anxiety and depression, irritability or short temper might be a symptom if it's a change from their usual personality. This doesn't mean that everybody who is a bit irritable is exhibiting symptoms of depression. For some of us, it's just the way we are. Very importantly, our symptoms should be affecting our functioning, negatively affecting it. That is, our relationship building skills, our ability to work and to learn should be negatively impacted by what we're experiencing. And if these 3 things are happening, then our symptoms have reached disease level. Mental diseases, just like any other diseases, are real and they can be biologically and or environmentally driven, and they can happen on a whole variety of timescales and a whole variety of severities. They're very varied, just like physical diseases. Many of them are preventable and highly, I would say, surprisingly treatable. And something that's very important to prevention and recovery is to build a mentally healthy climate and culture. So drugs or therapy alone, for example, will often not be enough for long-term recovery if somebody is working or living in a mentally unhealthy environment. This is arguably a little bit different to physical disease, and it's something we'll come back to a lot in this talk. Okay, so the first mental diseases we're going to talk about are mood disorders and anxiety. The most common mood disorders are depression and bipolar disorder. And anxiety disorder is something which is highly comorbid. That is, it often co-occurs with depression and bipolar disorder and can also exist alone. Mood disorders underlie a huge number of suicides that take place. So it's really imperative that we understand and address them. They're unfortunately fairly common. So at any given time, if I surveyed the general population, I'd find that about 6.7% of people are exhibiting symptoms of depression and bipolar disorder, and about 6% meet criteria for anxiety disorder. If I were to only survey graduate students, do you think those numbers would be the same? Absolutely not, they're much higher. Among graduate students, about 39% of people meet criteria for depression or bipolar disorder and about 41% for anxiety. This does not reflect well on us, in my opinion. This should be a call to action. It's not only important that we treat these mood disorders for sort of general well-being, but it's also the most effective way to prevent suicide, which is unfortunately also something that is a little bit more common in academia than in the general population. So the symptoms are, as the name would suggest, changes in mood, often very low or very high energy moods. Sometimes also physical changes like weight gain or sleep problems, behavioral changes, which of course come with the mood, and thought disorder, which is having thoughts that aren't our usual ones that we would choose or encourage and maybe are a little bit invasive. There are a lot of causes, and various different causes might be affecting the same person. Some of them are things that we can understand relatively well, or maybe not understand, but change relatively well ourselves, like nutrition, sleep patterns, and exercise. Some of them take a bit more work to understand or identify, like immune system dysfunction, genetic causes, or trauma in our past. Something I'd just like to flag while we're here is that when we say nutrition and exercise, this doesn't mean that somebody has to eat the most perfectly healthy diet of the moment and work out for an hour a day really hard to stave off depression. This can just mean eating enough and walking outside once a day. It's very individual, but it doesn't have to be something extreme. At various points in this talk, we'll give a little media recommendations from Dragonfly Mental Health, and we have our first one here. So Professor Kay Redfield Jamieson is an American psychologist who has lived with bipolar disorder for a very long time and has written a memoir about this called An Unquiet Mind. The reason we recommend a lot of this media is because it shows stories of academics living well and successfully with various mental disorders. Okay, the next thing we'll talk about is something that may be very familiar to us, which is burnout. This is often conflated with depression, but it is different, and we'll see how in the upcoming slide. So burnout is very work-related and very environmental. So it involves exhaustion, which may be emotional, mental, or physical, reduced resilience and adaptability, so struggling to learn, struggling to change and grow, cynicism about our tasks at work and the people we work with and their needs and interests, and unsurprisingly, given all of that, reduced performance, reduced concentration. The cause is chronic stress, usually related to work, possibly other ongoing activities in our lives. It's often related to a lack of control, because when we're working very hard but don't have creative control, this is not good for us. It can also be related to bad work environments and relationships. And of course, the infamous work-life imbalance. If we work too much, we will become stressed no matter how much we love what we do. The things that help are also quite environmental and can be implemented preventatively in our workplace. So a really good first step when somebody might be starting to get burned out, or if they're further along, is to take a break or a holiday. And a break should mean a true break, not one where you have your phone with your work email in view all the time, but letting work completely fade from one's mind for however long is necessary. Longer term, though, we have to improve our work environment. So a lot of this can mean sort of standing up for ourselves and stating our needs, negotiating different working hours, different accommodations in our workplace, and addressing the way we communicate in our workplace, or maybe the way other people communicate with us in our workplace. It can be very helpful to look for support and friendship and relationships. This might be going for coffee with someone you get on with. It might be something more formal, like a PhD support network. And on the more personal level, anything that's relaxing, getting enough sleep, mindfulness and meditation, and again, exercise can help. I think that in academia, there's a sort of glorification of burnout, and we act as if it's the only way to be successful. This is absolutely not true. It is not good for productivity, and we should be working to prevent it. The next disease we'll talk about is psychosis or schizophrenia. The symptoms of this are a disconnect from reality. That is, what somebody is sensing or experiencing does not match up with what's happening in their environment. And this can lead to some bizarre or confusing behavior, delusions where we believe that other people are saying or thinking or doing things that they're not, hallucinations where we sense things that are not there. This could be visual, it could also be sounds, smells, feelings, and chaotic, incoherent communication, speech or writing. This is largely genetic, about 50%. There are also some environmental triggers that might cause or exacerbate psychosis. Extreme sleep disturbance and drug use can cause it, and it could also happen as part of another disorder, such as bipolar disorder or borderline personality disorder. It's thought that maybe up to 50% of people with borderline personality disorder have some psychotic features. And this is a little linguistic note that we make. When it happens as part of another disorder, we tend to say psychotic feature instead of psychosis, because we're talking about a different illness. Psychosis only affects about 1% of the population, but I think everybody's heard of it, and there are quite some myths around psychosis, so it's good to discuss it and understand what it is and be able to identify when someone might be struggling. There are several things that might help. So there are antipsychotic medications of various kinds, and also different kinds of therapy and behavior therapy. And we have another one of our media recommendations here. So Professor Ellen Sachs has written a memoir about her career as a professor of law, psychology, and psychiatry. So a very successful and varied career with schizophrenia called The Center Cannot Hold. So we briefly mentioned that substance use could be a factor in some illnesses. And in fact, substance use disorder is its own distinct mental disease. Substance use is, for many people, just a part of life. So when does it become a disorder? When does it become something where we might need help? It's when the use gets out of the user's control, essentially, when they're using daily or very frequently, and using in an extreme way. So binging, which might lead to blackouts and physical and mental illness because of their use. They might have to lie about it or hide it and find that either their cravings or the effects of their substance use are impacting their ability to work, impacting their relationships, and unsurprisingly, impacting their health, both mental and physical. This is something else that's about 50% genetically caused. There are certain things that can provoke it or cause it as well in our environments. Quite often people turn to substance use as a coping behavior when they're either suffering from another mental illness and not getting treatment, or when they have some life circumstances that cause them to want to escape. This is very understandable, of course, but it's not actually a medication. Social pressure can, in some places, encourage people to seek this as a method of, I would say, coping or numbing rather than medication. And of course, access can be a factor as well. And especially in places where genuine medical help is hard to access, sometimes substance use is the most accessible, immediate coping mechanism. What can help? There are detoxification and rehab programs that can help in sort of short to medium term. Long-term support is also essential, so meeting with support groups, getting therapy or counseling, and having a supportive, understanding environment. And of course, if there's a co-occurring mental health problem or a life situation problem, other than a mental health issue, that has to be addressed as well. That's absolutely critical. And so now we're moving into a sort of slightly different genre of mental illnesses in the way that I'll talk about later. And the first of these is obsessive compulsive disorder. So the symptoms here, there are two main kinds. There's the compulsion, which is a strong urge to perform routines or rituals, so physically doing things. And there's the obsession, which is unwanted thoughts, repetitive thoughts, intrusive thoughts, and maybe fears or phobias. People can sometimes lose up to hours in their day to these rituals and thoughts, and it can really make someone want to withdraw, either to avoid triggers or to not be seen performing their rituals, or to not accidentally share their impulsive, intrusive thoughts. We don't know to what extent quite, but it's genetically caused and might also be caused by some real structural differences in the brain, and it can also be brought on or exacerbated by experiences of trauma. About 1% of the general population meet criteria for obsessive compulsive disorder. In STEM fields, it's about 3.5% of us, which means that whether or not we know it, most of us probably know somebody who has OCD. What can help? Cognitive behavioral therapy can help, as well as exposure response prevention, and there are various medications that can help with managing symptoms. If you want to learn a bit about academic life with OCD, Nadina Muller is a gender studies reader in the UK who has a blog about academia and life and health, covering various topics, including this. The next thing we'll discuss is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. This actually has different subtypes: hyperactive, inattentive, and combined hyperactive and inattentive. That means not everybody with ADHD necessarily is has the hyperactive type that's sort of more discussed publicly. And exactly which symptoms somebody experiences and in what balance depends on them individually and on the subtype of ADHD they have. What are the symptoms? Difficulty focusing, especially in certain situations like listening to people speaking, being easily distracted, which often leads to misplacing or losing things. At the other end, hyperfocus, which sort of can't be broken, and persevering with tasks that it's not necessary to continue with or that somebody doesn't want to continue with. Trouble following through or acting on things, trouble managing time, and being restless and fidgety and uncomfortable. ADHD is quite unusual in that part of the definition is that these symptoms must be present since childhood. Importantly, this doesn't mean you can only be diagnosed as a child or that only children have ADHD. It just means that the symptoms must have existed since childhood, and this can be assessed retroactively as well. This is overwhelmingly biologically caused. It's 75% heritable. It's caused by multiple genes, and environmental factors can also play a role in either its onset or its severity, or when it sort of manifests. There are lots of things that can help with ADHD, and this will again vary with subtype and individual person. There are different kinds of medications. Environmental supports, so this can be things like the way we set up our workplace or home or place of learning, skills trainings to work with or around the symptoms of ADHD, and psychotherapy, which is largely to support people living with ADHD rather than to fix it. So to help them change the way they view themselves, because people with ADHD often suffer from a lot of frustration, understandably, with these symptoms, and sort of low self-esteem or negative self-talk. I kind of already alluded to the stereotype about ADHD being something that children have, but in fact, probably less than 50% of children with ADHD will, so to say, outgrow it in adulthood. About 6% of children and youths meet criteria for ADHD, and about 2.5% of adults. And a lot of those adults who maybe don't meet the criteria anymore will still be affected by it. So they will have some symptoms, but maybe not enough to meet the diagnosis, or they might not need as much support anymore. And the last thing we'll talk about then is autism spectrum disorder. This is a developmental condition, and as the name implies, it occurs on a spectrum, and this is a very wide and varied spectrum, but the sort of overarching symptoms are challenges in social interaction, so challenges of learning social rules or understanding them, speech and nonverbal communication issues, so not only necessarily forming speech or being able to speak, but understanding things like body language and signals from other people, or mimicking them in a consistent way, which most of us have learned. And it can involve restrictive and repetitive behaviors. So either some things that somebody struggles to do, or some things that they maybe can't help but do that restrict them in some way. This is a genetically caused disorder, and there are lots of different things that might help. So for some people, various medications which overlap with depression, ADHD, and OCD medications can help with their symptoms. There are various kinds of therapy, including psychotherapy and educational therapy, but also sensory integration therapy. This wasn't mentioned in the list, but a lot of people with autism experience of sensory processing differences or sensitivities. And I'm only bringing this up personally, but I've noticed in the discussion around autism and some other disorders, there's quite a lot of movement to not talk about treating or curing autism, but learning to accept and live with and support autistic people. So that's something that you might notice in the recent discussions about autism spectrum disorder. Our media recommendation on this topic is a book by Oliver Sacks called An Anthropologist on Mars, which is a collection of writings. And the title story, so to say, is about Temple Grandin, who was or is an animal behaviorist and was one of the first people to really speak openly and publicly about life with autism, and has become quite famous for that, and I think has a biopic even. There's quite a strong community of autistic people working in academia, and a good place to maybe start to find out about that is just by looking up the Twitter hashtag Autistics in Academia. And there are people sharing experiences and kind of tips and resources that might be useful. So these are all of the specific diseases or conditions that we wanted to talk about. And to wrap up this section, we want to sort of cycle back to some things that we've already said that are very important. And they're important and they're good. They're positive news. So mental diseases are very treatable. About 80% of major depressive episodes respond to standard treatments, so standardly available drugs and therapy. And there are things that we all can do to help people with recovery and prevention. So awareness, which starts with coming to a talk like this and continues with learning in our communities or alone, which helps with identification, and early identification and treatment are very important for a fast recovery. We mentioned way back at the start of this section, or even at the start of the talk, that the reasonable time period for depression and anxiety is 2 weeks. Unfortunately, most people wait 6 to 8 years before they seek treatment, and will wait until they're in that crisis state that we want to avoid. And this waiting not only means a lot of unnecessary suffering, it can also mean that they develop other disorders, or maybe even develop some physical illness because they're not able to take proper care of themselves, and all of this just delays treatment response. That is, it delays recovery. So that early identification and encouraging people to seek treatment is really important. And this is all part of community and culture. So having a supportive community that not only encourages to take care of ourselves and prevent mental illness where possible, but also kindly encourages us to seek treatment and encourages us through treatment is absolutely critical. I say this a lot, but I cannot say it enough. So now let's talk a bit more about academia specifically. Mental illness is a difficult problem in any circumstances, and academia is an especially difficult circumstance to be in. It's very stressful and it's very competitive. We've already mentioned that graduate students have 8 times higher rates of depression and anxiety than in the average population. It's also been found that people with high IQ and high levels of education not only have higher rates of these mood disorders, but are less likely to seek treatment. And our academic culture, as it is, generally doesn't encourage us to take care of ourselves or seek treatment, especially because it is so competitive. We kind of don't want to take time off or admit that we have what might be seen as a weakness. Though, of course, it is not, it's part of life. In addition to all of the stresses that come with being an educated, hardworking academic person, there are some additional impacts on mental health for people who come from historically marginalized identities. And I say historically marginalized rather than minority because many of us are not actually minorities. We're just minorities in education, in science. There are a lot of big structural problems facing us, as being various groups, including women, LGBTQIA people, people from poorer or less educated backgrounds, people of color, and so on. But there's one particular thing that all of us can help to address, and that's what we're going to talk about next. And it's microaggressions. And this is something that happens a lot in every workplace, including academia, and in social circles as well. Microaggressions are things that we say that seem harmless, but that people hear so often that they build up and they start to feel aggressive or even violent. And they're just sort of things that say, hey, you're different in this way, aren't you? Or, hey, I noticed that you're weird to me. And exactly what that is will vary very much depending on who we are and who we're talking to. But we have some examples here of some particularly egregious remarks that people have heard. So I think with all of these examples, if you can see them, none of them is in itself a major issue. But when we hear these things day in, day out, they make us feel a little bit chipped away at. They can cause people to feel isolated because they serve as a reminder that we're somehow not the standard scientist, not the standard academic, not the standard clever person. And that isolation and sort of invalidation of who we are and what we're doing can make us anxious because it makes us always vigilant, not only for hearing these microaggressions, but also for trying to assess how they were meant, what this person is doing. Are they a threat? Is it just a bad joke? And of course, this can lead to causing or exacerbating anxiety and depression. So a really important step in improving mental health in academia is to stop doing this to each other. And I really mean all of us need to stop because people from these communities can also do it to each other. So what do we need to do? Well, the very first step is to be aware that we're doing it in the first place. So be aware of our assumptions, be aware of the way we think about the different people around us, and question them and reassess them. And a lot of workplaces are starting to address this with things like implicit bias trainings. Depending on the workplace, a very frank conversation can also be helpful, but that's a little bit more risky. And the second step is to apologize. Apologizing to someone lets them know that you realize what you've done, and it can help them to stop having to feel so vigilant around you. And in that sense, it's very important. It lowers their stress. And it's also good for building a better working relationship, which came up when we talked about burnout. It's very important to have good working relationships. It's very good for our stress levels if we feel comfortable around the people we spend 8 or more hours a day with. The last thing I'll talk about is a sort of comparison that we often like to draw. And that's between athletes and academics. Athletes are people who train very hard and give a lot of their time and effort, if not all of it, to achieving peak performance in a very specific sport in their field. And they know if they have an injury that they need to address it immediately, even if that means stopping an important match in front of half the world to have it looked at. They also know the importance of rest days and off seasons, and they understand that the same athlete won't perform at the same level all the time. Academics are similar in that we're also training very hard to reach the top of our field. Most of us are training our minds rather than our bodies, but it's a very similar situation. What we don't do is have the same awareness of our instrument, our brain. We don't notice when it's injured, or if we do, we quite often just try to carry on and not say anything. We have almost no concept of off seasons or holidays in academia. And a lot of people will beat themselves up if they have varied performance levels throughout the year or throughout their career. And so while we're not suggesting that the world of sport is perfect, we've seen in the last years especially that they have their problems too. We think there are lessons to be learned about rest and about assessing performance and addressing injury. So we're almost ready to hand over to the discussion now. But before we do that, a sort of prompt for you to think about. Dragonfly asked some of our previous participants, what is stopping them seeking help with their mental health? And on the other hand, what has helped them or what can help them? And we have their answers here weighted by frequency. And I think this is really interesting and kind of positive. So we see the main things that are stopping people are stigma, fear, shame, social embarrassment, knowledge. These are all things that we can address within our communities, even if we have limited resources. They're things that, for example, PhD students can help each other to overcome. The things that can help reflect this very well too. We've got friends, talking, support, others, students, listening, mindfulness. Again, these are things that we can access or give to each other to help. Of course, there are some things like therapy or counseling or professionals that are a little bit harder to access, but I think this is good news overall. And I would also like to let everybody know that at least in most of Europe, therapy for burnout and depression, anxiety, and bipolar disorder is surprisingly accessible on state healthcare or health insurance, especially if one is able to get a GP or maybe like a student welfare officer to help with the health insurance application. I think a lot of people assume it will be very hard to access, and it needn't be. So this is everything from me for now, and I would like to hand over to you for questions either about the talk or about advocacy in general, if you'd like to talk to me about that. And if anybody wants to sort of share experiences or remarks on mental health and mental health activism, they're very welcome.